Well, hello again. I am incredibly excited to have this opportunity to present to you today some of the research that my students and collaborators have been focusing on over the last few years. So for those of you who don't know me, as I mentioned before, I am a forest ecologist. I focus most of my research on fire, and I run the Forest and Fire Ecology Lab in the Department of Forestry at Mississippi State University. So members of my lab, we focus on fire. Like I said, we're interested in how fire influences the composition, structure, function, and fuels in forest systems, and then how changes in those components influence the fire regime. And we do this across a variety of ecosystems, like Josh mentioned. So much of my research is focused in upland oak forest and mixed oak and pine forest. But I also have work in the Siberian Arctic, where we're looking at forest response to fire, as well as in coastal prairies and in thorn scrub forest. And so we're quite a bit all over the place. But fortunately, in Mississippi, northern Mississippi, there are a lot of upland oaks, and so I work there, and I work a lot in western Kentucky in the Knobs region, where it's dominated by upland oak forest as well. So we have two fire-related questions in upland oak forest that we're focusing on in our research program. The first is much of what we've been talking about, and it was really super cool to be out in the field yesterday, and I was so impressed with what the Pennsylvania Game Commission has been doing on their sites in terms of oak regeneration and fire management, because it's tough, and there are a lot of questions I think that still need to be answered, and we're all struggling with, we want to burn and we want to see changes in our forests, but it's oftentimes very difficult to burn. That's one of the biggest challenges, is actually getting a fire going at times. And so it's super cool to see what you guys have been doing, and I was really impressed. But so we're addressing similar questions. We want to understand, when is the right time to burn? How often do we need to burn? What type of fire severity do we need to achieve in order to knock back oak competitors and promote oak regeneration? So we're trying to address a lot of those questions. But we're also really interested in understanding, what is it ecologically that drives fire in these systems? What are the traits of oaks that actually propagate fire? They've evolved in the presence of fire, and what allows them to do this in terms of their canopy, their bark, their leaf litter traits. And really interesting on the other side of that is this question of mesophication, right? So we see these compositional shifts that are happening in our forest. We're moving away from oak dominance. We're starting to get non-oaks that are fire-intolerant species, especially red maple, black cherry, winged elm, although maybe black cherry is more fire-tolerant than I thought. But those trees, and we all know this sort of anecdotally, really differ from upland oaks in their morphological characteristics. And those morphological characteristics really have implications for how forests burn. So we're really interested in understanding what is it about different trees that influence the way that fire moves through the system. And so this is the conceptual diagram on your right that's showing, that if you look at an upland oak, there are things about its canopy and things about its leaf litter, things about the bark that influence stem flow, the way the martyr moves down that bark. And all of those could influence the way the ecosystem functions and a way that fire moves through the system. So those are some really important and interesting questions that we've been focused on. So I want to talk first just briefly about fire as a management tool and what we found on a couple of the sites that we've been working on. I'm going to move through this part kind of quickly because I've presented some of this stuff before, but the second part of my talk that's focused more on traits, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on, because this is hot off the press stuff. This is the first time that I've actually presented a lot of this, and so it's in various stages of completion, some of which we've just set up, but it's cool stuff to think about, so I'm going to talk about it a little bit. But in terms of fires and management tool, we have two sites that we've been working on. Like I mentioned before, one of them is in western Kentucky at Bernheim Arboretum and Research Forest, which is about 14,000 acres in the Knobs region of Kentucky, really diverse topographically. This is, chestnut oak, black oak, scarlet oak, white oak, with a mid-story that's really red maple and American beech. And most of the forests are closed canopy. So we're looking at, in the understory, maybe 2-3% of surface irradiance. haven't had fire on them 60, 70, 80 years. Mature oak overstory, similar to Todd's forest at about 30 meters squared per hectare, 120 basal area, and so pretty densely stocked, low light. Bernheim is pretty cool. It's privately owned, and they have had a burn program in upland oak forest for about the last 20, 25 years, but they're burning at a pretty low or pretty small scale. So the plots are 10, 20 acres. And Bernheim, interestingly enough, and you'll see this with some of the results, they have an interesting management perspective, and maybe some of you can help me think about how to deal with this, but they don't want to harvest, they don't want to remove, they don't want to cut a tree, and they don't like to use herbicide. So much of the management is fire alone, right? What can we do with fire alone? Can we do anything with fire alone? And they also have an invasive species problem. The other site is at Spirit Hill Farm in Mississippi. Mississippi State University is very fortunate in that we have what are called our bulldog forests, so private landowners can donate their lands to the university, and then those of us who work at the university can use those lands for our research, which is great, right? Because working on private lands, you can actually get away with doing a lot of stuff that you can't do on federal and state lands. And so it's very helpful for research. But so we've been working in North Mississippi, and depending on who you talk to, that's kind of the southern edge of the central hardwood forest. So these are stands that are dominated by, we have some white oak, but it's mostly post oak, southern red oak, mockernut hickory, and then the mid-story, our non-oak competitors are things like winged elm and eastern hop hornbeam. So a little bit different than it is in the southern Appalachians and further north in the central hardwood region. But again, closed canopy forest, haven't seen fire for probably 75, 100 years. So at Bernheim, what we have learned over the last few years is that if you're using fire alone, and even if you have multiple fires, that what fire is good at doing, even a single fire, is knocking back beech. So this is a graph showing sapling density. So these are stems that are 2 to 4 inches in DBH, and of American beech, which is in blue, hickory, red maple, and light blue, and then red oak and white oak. So these are red oaks grouped together and white oaks grouped together. And what we found, again, is that fires knock back beech, and beech is a big oak competitor on their stands, and so that's good, right? So we're knocking back beech. But if you look at red maple, which is the light blue triangle, it's having virtually no impact on red maple, and this is because red maple is a prolific resprouter, and unlike here in Pennsylvania, the deer densities are not high enough, I guess, to actually influence red maple by deer browse. And so if you look at the oaks, you'll notice that we're having very little impact on oaks. It's not like you see a spike in sapling density of oaks following a couple of fires, and even with a pretty long fire-free interval of about 5 years. This is a picture to demonstrate what I just showed. The photo on your left is showing a site that was burned one time on the left, and then a trail running through that, and on the right you'll see an unburned stand, and it's pretty clear beech are marcescent, right? So they're holding their leaves during the wintertime, so it's really, really obvious where beech is on the landscape in the wintertime. And after one fire, it's a pretty dramatic difference in how much beech we're seeing on those stands. But then over on your right, this is a stand that's been burned 2 times, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with this response, but red maple, particularly once you get above 5 or 6 inches in diameter, they're pretty good resprouters, right? So knock it back 2 times, but man, that whole stand, look at that ground, it's all covered with red maple resprouts. And so this is a big issue at Bernheim, is this red maple issue, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with that. One thing that was interesting and not really all that surprising is that if you look at oak seedlings, so going into a smaller size class, so things that are smaller than DBH tall, and you burn a couple times, you do increase regeneration growth. So you burn a couple times, things are growing taller, 3 times taller than they were before you burn them, or didn't burn them. But the problem is that even though you might elicit a positive response out of the oaks, that the competitors are doing equivalently well. And so it's tricky, right, to sort of understand whether or not this is actually in the long run going to end up better for oaks. So these are the changes in density are one thing, but this is looking at actual individual seedlings that have managed to survive the fire. And you can see in the picture on the right that most of those seedlings, those are oaks, but they're interspersed with some maples and some beech and some other things that have managed to survive and come up in those stands. So we've yet to see a strong oak advantage post-fire in our stands at Bernheim. Again, these are low-intensity, dormant season fires. Red maple resprouting is prolific. The deer browse, kind of knocking it back, doesn't really seem to be helpful in Kentucky. The fires alone are not opening up the canopy. We saw that changes in light levels were only at most about 5%, and so we're still really in closed canopy situation, unfortunately. And again, you know, what do you do when the managers on those forests don't want to thin or herbicide? How many times do we have to burn in order to make a difference? Is it going to make a difference? And then microstegium is a real problem on those stands, and the biologist there is really reluctant to burn because she's afraid that all the stands are just going to get taken over by stiltgrass. And that's a real legitimate concern, I think. So, you know, we've kind of gone back and forth about what to do on these sites, but I welcome any advice that any of you have on that. The other thing that we've been thinking about, kind of moving away from actual regeneration, is thinking about acorns. So I often hear managers ask a question about, you know, what do you do when you have acorns in the ground? It's, can you burn when the acorns are on the ground? What's going to happen to my acorns if I burn when they're on the ground? And so we have started thinking about this more, and we've been thinking about it in terms of, you know, what the implications of burning in the fall are for acorn drop. You know, also thinking about it in terms of, you know, it's so hard to burn, right? And to get your burn in the spring, or to get it in the growing season is almost impossible. But thinking about expanding the burn window, fall is often a really nice time to burn, particularly in the south. We get good fronts coming in, it's dry, the humidity's low, but there's this acorn issue. So let's test that. And then the other question is, you know, there's a lot of talk of changes in fuel loads in the east, and if you have situations where your fuel loads are high, what could that mean for acorn viability after fire? And so I have this really incredible undergraduate researcher who works in my lab, Rachel Nation, and she has undertaken this super cool project where we collected thousands and thousands of acorns with help of Marcus Lashley's grad student, who Marcus is here today, but collected all these acorns. We created these plots out in the field that had different fuel loads. We laid down acorns, and so these are our plots. We're setting them up. You can see we put little breaks around them. These are about 1 meter square. We have fuel loads that are kind of unmanipulated or just normal, which would be one time, and then we doubled and tripled our litter fuel loads. We laid white oak and shimard oak acorns down in a gridded fashion on top of these plots, and then we set them on fire. And so we burned them one day in early December, which was perfect burning conditions. We had no problem igniting these plots. And then you can see us out in the field collecting or trying to find our acorns after we burned them. We collected these acorns after they were burned. We brought them back to a greenhouse and we germinated them. And then we tracked acorn germination and then the growth of any acorns that did germinate over several weeks. And what we found was that there's two graphs here. The one on the left is looking at percent germination of acorns, and the one on the right is looking at the growth of those acorns that actually did germinate. And then there's 4 lines. The green line are acorns that we didn't burn at all. The orange line is normal fuel loads without manipulating them. And then the blue and the pink lines are if we doubled or tripled fuel loads. And what is striking, first of all, is that if you double or triple fuel load, you kill all your acorns. Probably not a surprise. Most of our control acorns germinated, so we had viable acorns, 85% of them germinated. And then if you burn them under normal fuel loads, you kill about 50% of your acorns. And there was slightly higher mortality for white oaks than shimard oaks. And that's because white oaks germinate in the fall, right? So many of them, the radicle may have been out, or they're probably the acorn seed coat is also thinner in white oak, probably more susceptible to burning. But we only killed about 50% of our acorns. And so maybe if you have a mast year, you might be willing to accept that, right? If you have a lot of acorns on the ground. If you didn't, then you might kill all of your crop. But the interesting thing, I think, is that if the ones that did germinate actually grew just as well as the ones that had been unburned. So there doesn't seem to be any detrimental impact on the growth of the seedlings if you burn them. They grow just as well. And we harvested all the seedlings and we're looking at root-shoot ratios now. I don't have that data yet, but I'm really interested to see if there's any change in the below ground biomass allocation that happens with those acorns, because that's super important for oak resprouting response later on if they're top killed. So we have another study that we just started, and I don't have any results, but I think this is super fun and exciting to think about, so I'm going to tell you about it, is looking at burn season, predator access, and seed type on forest regeneration. So the idea here is that we're trying to expand the burn window. We want to be able to burn in every season if we can, but there's some changes in both seed predator populations as well as the seed bed that happen that could really influence what we're getting. So the idea might be, like if you dormant season burns, we burn in March or early April, but that's right before red maple and winged elm and all these non-oak competitors put out their seeds. So we could just be prepping the seed bed for non-oaks. Or if we burn before an acorn crop in the fall, like right before it, that could be actually really good for acorns in terms of seedbed quality, but it might make them more visible to predators because we just cleared off all this leaf litter. So we set up this study where we have 5 different burn season treatments. We have a control where we don't burn at all, and then we have fall, summer, spring, winter. And then we have each of those are subdivided into seed application treatments. So we're putting down red oak and white oak acorns when they would normally fall, and then we're putting down winged elm and red maple seeds when they would normally fall. And then we have those same treatments in a seed predator exclosure. So we built these big fences around the plots and to keep out anybody from eating the seeds. And so the idea here is that these guys, the squirrels and the deers, would be able to access the seeds, and over here we'd be able to keep out the squirrel and the deer and whoever else is eating. And we put game cameras out on our plots as well to be able to track who's coming in. And so I don't have any results from this, but I think it's a really cool and interesting idea to think about how the timing of seed fall and burning and whether or not seed predators are accessing these plots could be influencing regeneration dynamics. Okay, so summary: fire is a tool. Fires kill beech saplings, but not red maple. Fires improve seedling growth, but competitors as much as oaks. And burning post-acorn drop kills about 50% of the acorns, but those germinating grow pretty well. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about species effects on fire. So this is going back to that conceptual model that I showed you at the beginning and thinking about how different tree traits could influence the ability of fire to move through the system. And I'm going to talk specifically about bark and leaf litter. So I've been collaborating with Dr. Courtney Seagate. She's our forest hydrologist at Mississippi State, and her graduate student, Natasha Drotar, who's also at State. And they're really interested in canopy partitioning, so how water moves through the forest and how it's distributed through fall, so rain kind of moving through the canopy, and stem flow, so rainwater moving down the bark of the tree. And you guys know, we all know, right, oaks have thick bark. That's what protects them from fire. And many of their competitors, like red maple, sugar maple, winged elm, have thin bark. That's what makes them more susceptible to fire. Although there's some trade-off. As they get bigger, that trait becomes less advantageous. I mean, it becomes more. Non-oaks, actually, their bark gets thicker as they get bigger, right? So then they become less susceptible to fire. And so the data that I'm showing here is just data out of Courtney's lab, looking at bark roughness, and you can see the oaks are in red and the non-oaks are in blues and greens, and the bark roughness and the thickness trends were the same, both in the mid-story and the overstory are thicker in oaks and hickories than they are in maples and winged elm. So the interesting thing about this, though, is that this is a major fire protection mechanism in terms of just thickness, but what it also changes is the water storage capacity of the bark. So when the bark gets wet, if it's thicker and it's rougher, it stores more water, which is another mechanism by which the trees could protect themselves from fire. And then the other really cool thing about this that I've been really interested in, even since my dissertation, is that it influences the way stem flow moves down the tree and the amount of stem flow. So these are pictures from my dissertation work, which this was 12 years ago, looking at red maple and chestnut oak and how much stem flow you collect under, these are 20 centimeter diameter trees, a single rainfall event of about 2 inches. Those are 80-liter trash cans. One event, that's how much water red maple funneled down its bark. Super amount of water. That water is really nutrient rich, and it probably is influencing fuel heterogeneity because of impacts on fuel moisture directly around the bowl of the tree. Chestnut oak, only about 1/5 of the amount of water. This is being driven by bark characteristics. And Courtney and her student just recently showed that this is even more pronounced in the mid-story, which is really where we're seeing a lot of our mesophication happening and increases in the species. And so winged elm and red maple generate over an entire year about 1.6 to 7 times more stem flow than oaks. And so, the question that we're trying to answer now is like, what does that mean for the fuels that are around the bowl of that tree? Could that be another mechanism whereby these trees get protected by fire because the moisture of the fuels is being dampened by stem flow, especially during the wetter season? So I think that's another really interesting, fun question to think about. This is sort of a complicated graph, and Jesse, I think, is going to talk about this more when he talks about flammability, but I have 2 master students, Emily Babel and Jennifer McDaniel, who Jennifer's here, and she presented her work last night in the poster session, but there are really distinct leaf litter traits that vary between oaks and non-oaks that drive flammability. So there's a lot of work in the literature. Morgan Varner has published some cool stuff along with Jesse Crye on this, showing that there are certain leaf litter traits that promote fire and other leaf litter traits that suppress fire. So what Jennifer did and Emily is they measured a bunch of leaf litter traits, and then they kind of pulled them all together, and this is a PCA, and I'll explain that in a second, to look at how those traits relate to flammability. And what they found was that heavier leaves with higher volume, which these are mostly the oaks, have those traits are associated with higher flammability. And then lighter leaves with lower volume, those traits are associated with lower flammability. And that's our maples and even hickories, but American beech, winged elm, and they're distinct on this figure, right? So this is like a 3-dimensional space where points that are closer together are more similar than points that are further apart. So if you kind of look at all those leaf litter traits as a single metric, all the oaks separate on one side and all the non-oaks kind of separate on another side, although there's a gray area in between. But clearly these non-oaks that are encroaching in our forest have traits that are suppressing fire. The other thing, Jennifer did some cool studies sort of mimicking some of the work that Jesse Crye and Morgan Varner had done looking at moisture content in litter. And what she found is that as you increase the percentage of non-oak litter in a stand, you increase the initial moisture content of that litter. And so non-oak stands have higher fuel moisture, which means they're going to be less likely to burn. And then she did this really cool study where she manipulated litter loads and composition in the field, set them on fire, and we measured flammability metrics. And what she found on the right is that as you increase non-oak leaf litter, you decrease flammability. So as our forests are becoming more and more encroached upon by non-oak species, they're becoming harder and harder to burn. And then real quickly, my student Emily found that non-oaks also decompose faster than oaks. And decomposition is a major driver of fuel loads. So you have to consider fuel inputs and fuel outputs. Most of our fuels are leaf litter. If decomposition rates are super fast and you're losing most of that litter, then you have less fuel to burn. And so we calculated kind of back of the envelope that if you switched from a pure oak stand to a pure maple stand, you would decrease fuel loads by about 350 pounds per acre. So that's a pretty dramatic decline. So in summary, bark and leaf litter traits interact to influence fuel chemistry, loads, and moisture. Upland oaks have traits that promote fire, while the non-oaks have traits that suppress fire. And the kind of interesting part about this is there's going to be a threshold upon which it's going to get harder and harder to burn if we don't intervene and stop the encroachment of these non-oak species into our stands. All right, that was a lot really fast, but thank you, and questions if you have any.